Welcome, everyone, to the Wednesday morning series. Dr. David Fawcett is joining me again today. Hi, David.
Hey, Tammy, always great to be here.
And it's great to have you. I like you're such a wealth of information, and I feel like since we do this every 2 months, there's always new information because, especially with the co-occurring substances, that
Yeah.
world is constantly changing. So,
Yeah.
what do you have for us today?
Um, yeah, I think I'm still finding a lot of therapists and people in general don't really understand how these two addictions of some kind of substance, often amphetamines, and sexual behavior, including porn or sexual acting out, how those two things, if you had say one and one, it doesn't equal two, it equals three. And when those two things combine, it creates this like super I don't want to say superpower, but it's a really influential thing that's really hard to escape. And one of the ways I've seen it worded lately is this as a neurochemical trap, and I really like
Oh,
that
yeah.
concept. They talk about three stages basically of this neurochemical trap, where substances are taken, usually an amphetamine, so methamphetamine, cocaine, in Europe, methadone, but also other drugs that aren't at all stimulants, like GHB, which is a cousin of Rohypnol, which is this kind of people take it to kind of mellow the intensity of meth, right? But those drugs all uniquely, and cannabis, by the way, too, the much defended and some say maligned cannabis that we talk about a lot. It's a powerful drug that also creates this very sexual headspace, if you will. So you get these drugs that kind of facilitate heightening of sex, and then the sexual arousal itself. They hijack with this dopamine system in the brain, this reward circuitry, the little neurochemicals that give us pleasure, right? So we have this like drugs coming in and lighting up the sexual pleasure centers even more than they would normally. So suddenly the brain is like, okay, that's at attention now. This is something's going on that feels good, and it's very hijacking very quickly. This creates this reinforcement loop, and this is where we start to see where a trigger comes along, and it's no longer about drugs or sex, but about the combination of the two. So somebody will say, I've had a lot of clients, in fact, in our Tuesday night group, which is a great resource, if I forget to mention it later, free chemsex support group. But one of the guys was saying, he sees an attractive woman, um, and he doesn't feel sexual, he wants to get high. And
Oh, wow.
that's kind of this like weird trigger that I think a lot of clinicians, when they see it in their office, or people when it's happening in their families, like, what is going on? The question we've talked about before, women asking, why is my husband gay? He's having sex with other men. No, no, not at all. He's not gay. It's this drug this expansion of what we call the sexual template. So you get this reinforcement loop where it's like mixing salt and pepper. And once you get it all mixed up, there's no black and white. It's just kind of a speckled
Yeah.
mess. And I think that's what happens often when this reinforcement loop is established. And so then the third thing then is, how do we fix this? And the fix, of course, is retraining the brain to be happy and enjoy and notice the pleasure of sex and intimacy without being high. And that's why so many people in the beginning say, well, and I've had people like point their finger at me, accuse me of, dooming them to a life of
Mm.
vanilla or boring or no sex because it'll never be the same, blah, blah, blah. And it's not going to have the same intensity, but it's certainly, I think sober sex is so much better in terms of all the other neurochemicals that make us feel good. And it's a much more balanced and sustainable and really fun response. And as Dr. Rob said, I learned from him, just we all who are in this field are treating intimacy disorders, right? People don't know how to be vulnerable, or don't know how to trust, or don't know how to talk and share what feelings they're feeling. They don't know what they're feeling. And I think a lot of that makes sense when you look at people's early life. There's a lot of trauma and a lot of bad experiences where we learned early on it wasn't safe to talk about this stuff. And so, anyway, that makes those of us who had that kind of early origin really vulnerable to this kind of behavior because it's such a bright, shiny object, right? It can hijack. But anyway, that's a long way of just introducing this idea of this neurochemical loop that is a trap that really just kind of is really, really hard to break out of once these things merge. And I should just say, for people that are familiar with this idea of chemsex, or what we call sexualized drug use, um, it's when it becomes kind of a routine over and over again. So I think if people are always worried enough, if I have a beer or a glass of wine before, I get intimate with my partner? No, I don't think that's chemsex. But if you do that repeatedly, and if you hit the point where you have to have that beer or that wine before you can have then we're into dangerous territory, right? But it's not a clear line always for people to figure out. But I think when people realize, gee, this is not right, but it's very hard to resist it at that point. But there is help. I think that's the bottom line. I think very few places, Seeking Integrity being one of them, do a really good job with this. And because they recognize it and see it, and so many other treatment centers, as you and I know, Tammy, people have gone to really well-known, good substance programs, and they never see the sexual stuff. And people keep relapsing. They can't figure out why. So that awareness of, it's not just it's the drugs and the sex and the combination of the two, which makes this thing so powerful and dangerous. I don't use that word lightly, but I think it is dangerous for a lot of people.
Right. Well, and yeah, often high risk behaviors, lots of things. You talked about if I have to have a substance before I have sex. I'm also thinking if as soon as you have a substance, you are seeking sex, so that
Exactly.
that correlation as well. So
Exactly.
I mean, when they're paired together, when they're fused, whatever, that it like if one, you're probably doing both, then that does create the problem. So Dr. David mentioned earlier on Tuesday nights he does host the co-occurring sex and substance drop-in group. So this is a place for men to. It's free. But it's a place for men to talk about those things co-occurring, because you go to a 12-step group and let's say it's alcohol, you're going to talk about your alcohol, but no one's going to talk about sex. So this is a place where whatever form of substances is co-occurring, this is a place to talk about that and whatever form of sexual acting out, whether it's, all online or not. This is an opportunity to do that. But thought it was really interesting when you said, like the trigger, and I see an attractive woman and or attractive human and think of getting high, and I'm like, wow, that it feels like everything got really miswired, with that.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And a lot of people will never feel that compulsive sexual drive unless they're, under the influence, for example. Then it all comes, it like wakes it up and it becomes alive. And that's why it's so dangerous to recognize this drug side, right? And not just try to recognize the compulsive sexual piece. Uh, and that's I think the trap a lot of professional agencies and therapists don't see.
Yeah, I mean, Dr. Rob has talked to professionals. I just posted, somebody asked about the link for the co-occurring group. All of our drop-ins are on there, but you'll see that on Tuesday night. But Dr. Rob spends a lot of time talking to therapists about, like on an intake, they are not asking, he says, from the
Yes.
waist to the knees, which is, a colloquial way of saying, you got to ask about, what's going on, and for women too. I mean, like oftentimes, this happens with women too. This is not just a guy thing or not just a gay thing or what. I mean, this is happening, across the board. So we need to pay attention. And, we do tend to talk about cannabis because it just boggles my mind what is happening. Like I learned about cannabinoid hypermesis recently.
Mhm.
Like I was like, oh my gosh, like all of this stuff is happening, and everybody's like, well, it's just pot. It's not just pot. But I'm worried too with younger people who have the message that cannabis is fine, like what's going to happen with them, with this, as you're saying, the 1+1 = 3,
Right.
it's
Right.
scary.
And as we've said, the cannabis that's out there today is not the cannabis that you and I had back in the dorm rooms or whatever,
Yeah,
with sticks and twigs or whatever. And
yeah,
this is
yeah.
really stuff that leads to psychosis. People, a number of the young treatment centers are full, young adult places. They're all psychotic. They're in there with real psychiatric problems that sometimes are persistent. So it's a very vulnerable age too. All the onset of bipolar and schizophrenia, all that this kind of serious stuff happens usually in the early adulthood, and that's a very vulnerable time to be messing with one's brain and kind of, and these are people that are usually vulnerable to it anyway, but this almost like acts as a trigger to kind of set that whole process in motion. So it's not a easy or particularly safe drug for sure.
Right. Well, and with the hypermesis, like, I mean, people are having physical, I mean, surgeries because of, cannabis use, and, it's on internal things. It was just fascinating to go read about that too. And
Right.
we're talking about, adolescence or whatever, but I'm wondering, as you're saying, like bipolar, et cetera, do you, and maybe there's not research yet, but are you finding or hearing about, people who have maybe a mental health condition who are using cannabis, if there are, potentially more severe reactions to that?
Yeah, and this is a really new phenomenon. I'd say the last 5 years. So you're right, there's not a lot of research available, but I got curious last year and kind of put together a list of the top, 10 articles or whatever, and looked at them. And there's pretty significant and disturbing evidence, if you will, that two drugs, they said the highlighted two drugs can kind of encourage people who are prone already to schizophrenia, bipolar, or some kind of
Oh,
thought disorder. It can kind of trigger, it can wake it up, if you will. Those two drugs were methamphetamine and cannabis.
oh,
And
wow.
but what blew my mind is that with the meth group, a significant number, like I think it was a third of people, ended up getting psychotic symptoms that never went away. So
Oh,
I'm talking
wow.
about, sitting like I'm sitting here and the air conditioning is kind of coming out the air vent. They hear voices when that air streams out of the vent, that kind of thing all the time. And so it's really disturbing. And they often have to be on meds. Same thing with cannabis. I'm not sure. I don't think it was the third. I can't remember the number, but it's a significant number. So anyway, it's a dangerous drug to mess with. And when I started the meth work, the chemsex work 30 years ago, almost everybody got psychotic, but in a week it was gone.
Mm,
And now, so for a significant number, it never goes away. And that's because of the process. The meth we have these days is not the same meth. It's manufactured in a different way by the cartels in a way that's, they call it dirty meth. It's much more toxic, basically. So, and we're seeing the results. Yeah, bad, bad news.
yeah, and it's hard because I know once you start those things, and so, I'm not trying to be Nancy Reagan with just say no, but like I don't know how you intervene on, on a society who, it, where does it even start? And I know we've talked before about cannabis being an entry drug, although now it's significant enough. I'm going, it doesn't feel
Right.
like an entry anymore. So,
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I think it's a societal fix. I mean, obviously we heal the people, right? The individuals and the families and the partners and people who are affected by it. But you're right, it's a much bigger problem. And I think to me, it's, we talk about the the huge healing force of recovery being connection. I think it's increasing ways of people connecting without just kind of numbing out and opportunities or whatever. I think the more we get online, the more lonely we get, the more disconnected. It looks like everybody else is having a fun time and we're not. That whole thing. And so
mhm.
people start to then react and withdraw. And I think that's the exact opposite of what we need. You and I know from 12-step program that that's that connection. That's the magic sauce, right? That keeps it all together. Um,
Yeah, and we get a lot of people that reach out that will talk about, well, I'm trying to do this recovery thing, and what they're doing is they're listening to podcasts, they're watching videos, they're maybe reading a book, and I'm like, and there's zero connection, and and many are 12 step or group. I sometimes they'll be seeing an individual therapist, and I'm like, that's once a week for 50 minutes, and then there's the rest of the 24/7 and all of that. And we talk often the opposite of addiction is healthy attachment, but when people are resistant to that, and I think, as like you're saying, as a society we're doing more of the online, and disconnect, and yeah, it's there's a lot that feels like, and I'm hoping I I'm not completing my sentences, sorry, I do this. I find that we as society swing, I mean, one year it's mega mansions, the next year it's tiny houses, and then you kind of settle in the in between. So I feel like there will be a swing of like, oh my gosh, I'm so disconnected. All I do is, talk on my computer, and now AI, like I don't even have to think anymore. I can just type in a question, so I'm hopeful that, people start going like, that isn't what I really want, for connection and a life, that doesn't feel fulfilling. So how do I create those, connection opportunities? That's my hope. We'll
Yeah.
see how it plays
No,
out.
I think that's the way out.
Yeah,
Um, but I think we have to heal this kind of core, this basic, I think all of us are wounded, right? And in a way, and is that going back to that idea of intimacy disorder in our world here, I think it's just that ability to be vulnerable, the ability to trust, the ability to talk and feel, the ability to have empathy. And I think by far the most people we get are certainly capable of empathy. There's a small minority of people, right, that are not psychologically, they're just not wired that
yeah,
way, which is those are maybe the scary people to have. But I think
yes,
even though most of our clients probably show very little empathy in the acts they do and the hurt they've caused, they're capable of it. I think that's that training piece, right, if you will, learning how to feel what I'm feeling so I can try to feel what you're feeling, and
right.
and build on that. That takes time, of course, but that whole process I don't think has been safe or isn't safe in most people's lives. And I think some of the fellowship you're talking about makes it safe. You have people, like-minded people to talk to who can maybe get this.
And it's scary,
Yeah,
walking into a 12-step meeting, the first time or first few times, it's
yeah,
scary. And so being brave enough to go, yes, I need help more than I need to be, hiding, um
exactly.
because the
Exactly.
hiding isn't serving me. But man, our brains will want to go, no, this is no danger, so it's hard to be
Exactly.
willing to do that. But I often say nothing changes if nothing changes. So we have to be willing to do something different, that would be positive and help us, and what our the old saying of, our best thinking got us here. And so,
Mhm.
so we can't think our way, as addicts, we can't think our way out of this, but reaching out to others who are on that journey, really helps. So we would
Yeah.
welcome questions, everyone. I'm going to pull out while we have a moment, so Dr. David's book, I'm going to go to my magic cupboard, Sex Under the Influence. This is about it. So if you're working with a therapist and you struggle with co-occurring and they haven't gotten it, point them to this book. This would be a good primer for them, to start with. But yeah, I mean, check it out yourselves too, because, like Dr. David said, we have lots of clients who have gone through lots of substance programs, good ones, gotten help on
Mhm.
that level. Some have had abstinence from the substance for a period of time. We've had clients come to our residential treatment program that were abstinent from substances for years, and crazy into all of the sexual acting out, sexual addiction. So we do not treat things as well. If we treat this, then you're going to be all better. It's like we are looking holistically. We're addressing, those underlying issues. The like Dr. David said, there's something in us that from an early age we didn't learn to do this stuff well. So we want to help, point people to the right resources and healing. So um I missed the book title. Oh, yes, I can. So it's Sex Under the Influence. And I will put it in the
And
chat too. Understanding and healing from sexualized drug use. But yes, I will put that in the chat too. And it's on our
thanks.
website. We have everything. We have everything
Yeah.
on our website. So
It's really a logical, we try to do it as logically as possible. So just when people have questions, or mostly the tool, about half the book is resources and tools for recovery. So it's a very recovery oriented, kind of solution oriented book that I think is really, so many people don't understand this, and so many people are affected by it. This even Tammy and I've talked about this too. I go to AA meetings, and just there's so much sexual talk or talk about porn. It's just there, and people are clearly just transferred the whack-a-mole, transferred addictions to something else, but they're not wanting to see it.
Yeah, well, and yes, we go to 12-step meetings, for a certain subject, and like even be said, which this is one of the things I don't like about my 12-step meetings is like, we're here to talk about whatever the topic is, which is why having Dr. David's where you can talk about, sex and substances in one place. Woohoo. I mean, like
Yep.
with AA, lots of meetings, they want you just to talk about alcohol. I mean, like, oh my gosh, drugs, alcohol's a drug, so that doesn't make any sense. But anyway, but it's also like, and this too, where, somebody who gets sober from alcohol, and I was one of them. I gained a bunch of weight, so like I went, oh wait, let me use food. And so like
Exactly.
that's a more obvious one than some of the other things. But yes, you have to look at everything that is that we're using as a maladaptive coping mechanism if we really want to be happy, joyous, and free to borrow from 12 steps. So
Right.
okay, so the first question here is, I'm the betrayed partner. D-Day was 2 years ago. Is it possible that extreme cannabis use can cause a person to develop a porn addiction if they weren't using or addicted to porn before cannabis use? That's a great question. I'm curious too.
I think absolutely yes. I think, um, and I've seen this so much in the clients, I'd say lately too, last 5 years, the cannabis use has really become one of the central drugs in this whole idea. I think, and as it's become more powerful and accessible, I think that's also a factor here. It's legal and in well, not most states, but between medical marijuana and cannabis, it's illegal in most states. So it's accessible is my point. And so I think, yeah, it's gotten much more familiar, and absolutely it's one of those drugs that's like a perfect combination of porn and cannabis. The same kind of headspace and all these addictions, sex, porn, chemsex addiction, methamphetamine, they're all about stepping into fantasy, right? Stepping into that bubble, about disconnecting. Although it feels, people say, oh, I feel I love the connection. Well, it's a chemical connection with, the other bodies that you may be interacting with. But yeah, it totally. And I've seen a lot of guys say, well, I'm only online, so how can it be a sex addiction? Well, it is, right? Because your brain doesn't know the difference. The brain is doing exactly the same thing. So yeah, I think if there's like I don't know, it's like Tim, you got me hungry. I haven't had my lunch yet. Like, it's like the pepperoni pizza, right? So it's a
Yeah,
great combination.
yeah.
Cannabis and porn, the same thing. It's like one of those bad combinations once it becomes fixed. And the other thing too, and this is one of those things I've talked to clients, they've been sober, 6 months, 9 months, and then suddenly something triggers them, and they can be right back in that headspace in seconds, right? So that's what makes all these addictions so dangerous. It's so hard to really get away from the potential for being hijacked by those triggers and cravings when they pop up. It can be done, right? But it's a tough road. And I think that's the problem with sexualized drug use. These combination of drugs and sex is you have double the double the triggers and cravings, right? Not just the sexual ones, but now you have the drug ones as well. So, but anyway, to your question, yes, I think absolutely, it's a classic combination. And by the way, that begs the question about recovery. So I think recovery would have to include not just abstinence from porn, but abstinence from cannabis, because I guarantee you one is going to lead right back to the other. They're now cross-wired with each other, and that's going to be hard to break.
Well, and I'm going to ask this too. So okay, I'm willing to give up cannabis, but now I'm going to, drink wine, and and we see this often of like, well, that was the problem. So, this is okay. And can you expound on that, please?
Yeah, that's a really great point because oftentimes, like as I say, most of my work's been with meth users. So methamphetamine is like the strongest drug. So that's one that brings them to their knees. But then they say, well, I don't even like the sensation of being drunk on alcohol. I like the kind of crispy meth high. So why can't I have a beer with my friends just to be social? And the problem with that, in my opinion, why they can't have that beer is because it disinhibits everything, including their willingness to stay sober from meth. As many, many relapses have started out not with the intention of using the drug of choice, but to just have a beer with friends or to have a little toke on a joint. What's the problem? But in many cases, those two things, alcohol and cannabis, are the kickoff drugs for the whole sex addiction ritual and all its ugliness. You know, all the dark places it goes. It often starts with a beer or toke on a joint. If that's part of your ritual, that sets the whole thing in motion. So yeah, and it's so easy unless we deal with the feelings that we're running from anyway. We're going to be driven back towards something to numb us or escape us or um, and and I think many of us have tried. I personally think I've tried everything except gambling. Gambling never had any
Me
attraction for me,
either. I work too hard
but
for my money. So
I don't
yeah,
want to test it. I'm afraid to,
I
I'll say
know.
if
I'm not either.
I go to rarely in Las Vegas something for a conference or whatever, and I'll give myself $5 in quarters. That's it. Cut myself
Yeah.
off. But I don't want to test it because I know I'm so addicted to everything. So yeah, I just leave that wiring dormant right now for me.
Yeah, we can be in Vegas together. We would be fine. But and you talked about the intensity. You talked about that earlier too, of like, oh, I'm never gonna have, fun sex again, because and Dr. Rob talks about this all the time too, is like addicts seek intensity, and that is true. So intensity versus, connection. So shifting the focus, and even like we're talking about with alcohol or whatever, it's like, what is the goal? If the goal is to learn to live in a different way, not just swap out something for, like I'm still using external things to try to make myself feel okay. If we're going to
Exactly.
learn to be okay, and like I can have really crummy things happening in my world and still have joy and gratitude. Like I'm able to hold that space because I know, like, whatever situation is temporary. And ultimately, I'm in recovery, I'm working on being a person of integrity, I've got all of these things, that I could not have even imagined when I was active in my addiction. So there's that paradox of being able to hold the space for joy even when I'm not happy in the moment. And so if the goal is ultimately to be able to have joy and real connection and meaning in life, then we have to be willing to examine everything that we could be using, to numb out and escape. So, okay,
Absolutely.
the next question: with good recovery, how could how long does it usually take for men to grow up? Oh, oh, this is a good question. How long does it take, if you're in good recovery, to emotionally grow up and be an emotionally intelligent person past the age when they started? In my case, it started with him at age 12, and now he's 66. The good news is, if he's really doing well, it won't take the whole 54 years. So, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, yeah. I think back when I got sober, there was kind of a belief. I don't know if it was scientifically borne out, but they used to kind of stop developing emotionally when your addiction really takes hold, right? And I think most of us, that's adolescence. And that's certainly where I was when I got sober 10 years later. Um, and you're right, it catches up quicker, depending on life's lessons, hopefully a good therapist, recovery meetings, whatever, we can get there. But boy, it's work. And I think, sometimes when my first book, the subtitle was something going to be like reclaiming healthy sex and intimacy or something. And I realized there's no reclaiming. I never knew anything about it until I got sober. And I think that's the hard part. People just think, well, it was the drug was the problem, or the acting out was the problem. The addiction was the problem. And it certainly was a problem. But the addiction came in the context of all this other stuff that also has to be, you have to take a look at that, right? How we deal with people, uh, our own traumas and all the work that we need to do on ourselves. And the 12 steps are a beautiful roadway to do that, by the way. They're not therapy, but they sure mesh well with therapy. And I think, the bottom line, just to answer your question, and it links back to what you said before too, is I think a lot of times people confuse intensity with intimacy. And learning those two are very different things. That intimacy indeed can be intense, but it can be a lot of other flavors as well, right? Not just the intensity that people want all the time if they're in the sex and drug addiction mode. It's hard.
Yeah, and we use and it's a it's a generalization, but 2 to 5 years. And that is not just emotionally growing. And it's not like, oh, there's a switch that flips at 2 years or whatever. It's if you're doing the work, you're going to start to see, those glimmers of things that are like, oh, that's different. Oh, that was actually felt like some empathy. So it takes time, but the more work we are doing, then we are incorporating this. So yeah, and I love 12 steps because you know what, I'm sitting there and I'm like someone's sharing and I'm going, oh, like I can feel, for them. And that's a safe place to start because ooh, a partner is scary because like there's a lot of risk and vulnerability and I may mess it up and everything else. But someone sharing, I can go, wow, I relate to that, and helping me get in touch with, what am I actually feeling? We are not good at all of that stuff, which is why we, sought out external things. So, but so the hope is that your addict partner is leaning into really doing the work, and that you are seeing even before the 2 year mark, some progress towards that. So, and lots of people say, and I loved what you said about, you know, re, you know, reclaiming. And I'm like, we don't use rebuilding, we don't use reclaiming, because like rebuilding trust, people talk about how do we rebuild trust. I was like, one person wasn't trustworthy the whole time, so you want to build trust from a new foundation. So this is like, whatever you had back there, it's like, what do we need to do to move forward in a different way that we can build trust, that we can build emotional connection, and have that space, so that we can both be emotionally vulnerable with each other. That's true intimacy. And for those that are on this journey, we hear often both parties that are like, wow, I never wanted this. And nobody does. Nobody wants to be in this club. But what they have now is they're moving forward. You can have a much better relationship than you've ever had, in
Oh, yeah,
however many decades that you've been together. That is true and can happen, if you're both, doing the healing work. So.
totally. Yeah.
Okay, so the next one is, what about the connection between sex the day after using cocaine or MDMA, possibly to reduce the low feeling the following day?
Right. It's so interesting. I think what that has in common, like before building up to a sexual encounter or afterwards, is just the timing, right? Both of them are using drugs to manipulate feelings of some sign. And this is another thing too, where we often see sex and porn addicts and drug uh, chemsex addicts, people that combine drugs and sex, oftentimes have a peak in their substance use after they act out. And if we look at that addiction cycle, it's that shame and remorse phase, right? Oh my God, I did it again. I ruined my marriage. All the promises, all the times, all the months I worked, blah, blah, blah. We've lost it all. So what do? We medicate that. And oftentimes people medicate it with alcohol, with other drugs, with the drugs you're talking about, MDMA, and others, all of it to kind of, this time not so much to build the anticipation of sex and that kind of part of our brain, but more to deal with the shame, the regret, the sadness, the letting down, those feelings. But it's the same dynamic. It's using drugs to sort of soothe the feeling that's uncomfortable. So yeah, I'd be very cautious about that. But
So what I'm
and
hearing you say is whether it's drugs one day and sex the next, or sex one day and drugs the next, it still is, there could be the correlation between, I'm looking for whatever else, something external to make me feel okay.
exactly
Okay.
right. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And again, I use my example of like, I use food, so like that is like, I can use anything like you. I can use, not gambling, but I mean,
Right. And thank you for saying that, because I've been talking in my examples mostly about just drugs, but it could easily be, and we see this, by the way, interestingly, with men, male sex addicts. There's most of the research has been done on them, as often health research is often done on men. But what do they find? Work and food. Those are the
work.
two go-to
Yeah.
places. Like, okay, I don't want to deal with this anymore. What can I do to kind of numb out? What's the closest thing to acting out? Well, dropping into work, right? Getting lost, or or binging on food,
Yeah.
binging on TV. Those kinds of things also are very, very common, uh, with, and
Well,
need to
and with
be
work, you get a,
recognized.
oh, yay, you're doing such great work and you get a promotion or a raise or what. So that's very seductive
Yeah,
too, because, like it's esteemable. I'm doing my work,
exactly.
versus
Exactly.
the other things that we've been doing. So yeah, it's important to again, with our residential program, we're looking holistically across, everything that could be problematic, and it does not mean that somebody, coming out of treatment is, sanitized and now they won't do any of those things. But, having the awareness, like, you talked about with even with the triggers of like, okay, I have maybe more triggers because I've got more things that are applicable to me. And that
Right.
means I have to have a really good plan. Like I have to know that there's going to be triggers. Like that's just going to happen. That's life. And so what am I going to do so that I am prepared when I am triggered? I've got my safety plan of this is what I'm going to do, rather than finding myself going to, oh gosh, how did that happen? Well,
Right. Right.
because I wasn't following my plan or I didn't have a plan. So
No, and that's why it's so important. That's why good treatment that recognizes all these patterns in advance is really important and helps people see the danger there and can create a plan. And all this is totally manageable if you have that plan and the willingness to do it, right? To act in accordance with your integrity and your plan and make it happen. But it's a matter of foreseeing it and having resources because we can't foresee everything. So then we have a plan for that too, right? And the list, I still have a list, a paper list of phone numbers in my, I guess that's totally old school at this point with phone phone books online. It's my comfort zone, really. It's like a teddy bear. I have it in my wallet. Have I used it in 15 years? No, but but it's there.
but it's there, and like, yeah,
Yeah,
and I still
yeah.
have, like, this is funny because, like, and I knew right where it was, but this is the little, I mean, this is the pocket size, purse size,
Uh-huh.
and it has like, it's so small print I can't even read it, but I know it's got the 12 steps, it's got it's got
Yep.
a place for phone numbers, it's got, the serenity prayer, it's got everything on that little card. And when I was early on and before there were cell phones and they had everything, I had
Yep.
one of those with me all the time,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
yeah.
And that's what it
Okay.
takes.
It does, but and it takes it takes a willingness to do what it takes, and everybody's what it's going to take is a little different, but you'll find people that are able to help guide you. Okay, so thank you for hosting this information session. Even though my partner is not a drug user, I replaced the word drug with his other addictions. It still resonates because he numbs out with online world games and fantasy women. I appreciate putting this on. Yes. So can you talk about, all of the other things that go along with that?
Yeah. So, I mean, what's the goal here is to, as our friend Scott says, step into the bubble, right? To sort of to step out of my life. I remember numerous quotes from clients, but the one guy that comes to mind right now that said when he uses meth, he has 8 hours of bulletproof happiness.
Mm,
When life is just too
wow.
much, he can just step into this other world and it all disappears. Um, and and of course that person could disappear for 4 or 5 days too. It's like they're in that world for a long time. But so that's the goal. How we get there, we can get there all kinds of ways, right? With different drugs to take us there, with different behaviors, with porn, with sex, with gambling, with shoplifting, with binging on food, with work, with relationships,
Cutting.
with exactly cutting things that are kind of counterintuitive. It's like what? But yeah, there's a lot of self-destructive behaviors, overtly like that, self-destructive behaviors. A lot of times we recreate traumatic things in our lives. They're actual worst things, worst kind of people, worst relationships, worst episodes, and we're drawn to that. So there's this like dark side, right, that we have to recognize. So we have the potential, and I think addicts in general tend to be incredibly creative and opportunistic. And I think so we have the potential to find anything to get us into that space. And so we have to not only as we have a plan to deal with all that stuff and anticipate it the best we can, but to really be willing to, okay, I need to let that space go. Because that little place we go to when life's too intense, um, we just have to learn how to deal with the intensity. There's a wonderful, I'm a big fan of a kind of therapy called DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy. It's a mouthful. But one of the skills they have is distress tolerance. And I think most addicts, most intensity addicts that I've met, you know, the sex, the porn, the amphetamine users were really low intensity tolerance. So they don't like to be bored. They don't like to just sit here. They lose interest really, really quickly and stuff. And so, you know, there's all those represent little moments of potential trouble, right? And so to learn how to sit, yeah, this is uncomfortable. You know, I have to sit in a 12-step meeting. I don't like it and I'm bored. And it's like, no. But let's sit here in pain and learn how to do it and learn that we can do it. And so those kind of skills, they sound so basic as I'm saying them, but they're just really, really important to learn how to sit with that discomfort. Uh,
And
because we're
all
in,
of them are uncomfortable. Like good
yeah,
feelings and
yeah, yeah.
bad feelings initially were horrible. It was just all too much. It was intense. And whether it was a good feeling, presumably, or a negative feeling, it was a feeling and it was too much. I really struggled, with that. So yes, learning to sit in the uncomfortable, which to a non-addict person, so-called normie, like they'd be, seriously,
Yeah, I know.
but we
Right.
we have to to learn. I think it's also looking, examining my motives. I think of that often. It's like if I mentioned food, if I'm standing at the pantry browsing, is it because I'm hungry, or is it because I'm feeling something and whatever snack will help me. I have to pay attention to, I have to pay attention to all of those things. So at some point, if we're willing to go, what am I feeling? And am I looking for something external to help me feel better? Then it's probably a problem, if unless it's like, oh, I'm phoning a friend, because I need to connect. That's a good one, but if I'm looking for some substance or behavior, like gaming or food or whatever to make me feel better, yeah, that's probably a problem.
And you make such an important point, and that is that these these feelings, the discomfort feeling, the urges are not the problem themselves, right? That's being a human being. We have that stuff. It's how do we react to them? And we can react in good ways, right? I can pick up a phone and call somebody. I can go take a walk. I can pet my dog. I can put my hands in the soil and do something in the garden. You know, there's other ways of dealing with that besides numbing out. And I think that's what we have to help people realize. And I think I remember in my early days, like I don't want to do anything else. I want my form of numbing out. Thank you very much. You know, it's like until that be like you said today, early on, it's like until it became too painful, right? So it's just not worth it. Okay, I surrender. But for a while, it's that willingness is dicey trying to go there. But that's what it takes. And after a while, and the good news here is that you don't miss that stuff. I don't miss those old negative ways. And now everything's just second nature, right? These recovery things are just they're the ones that are now hardwired, if you will. So
Yeah.
it takes time, but
it,
it does
it,
happen.
yeah, it takes time, but you know, on this journey we call recovery, I can see, at any point, like even now, I know I'm still learning, and I can still grow, and I have opportunities, and I relish that. I didn't for a while because I was like, oh, I want to just arrive, I want to be all done with that. And then I went, wait, I have the opportunity to continue to grow, and it has been worth every at every step. And we're talking about the co-occurring in our program. We have a 14, 21, or 28-day length of stay. I will tell you that the 14-day is not going to be enough for someone with co-occurring. 28 would be recommended. 21 might be a fit. Usually it's 28, especially if there is active co-occurring. And people go, oh, I can't take. And I'm like, what is it stealing from you on a daily basis? How many hours, months, years are you going to forfeit to addiction, rather than getting the help, to be on a different path? We both have, nice chips, longer term sobriety, and we will do what we need to do to defend that. Like there is nothing in any form of acting out for me that is at all like you said, it's like pass, hard pass, don't care. I don't care. I don't like that. It holds no, I don't ever sit here and go, oh, I wish I could. I don't, like,
Me too. The same,
yeah,
yeah, right.
yeah, yeah, like, nope. Okay, so here's another good one. Can caffeine be used that way?
It's a great question. And one I've wondered about myself because that's the drug that I still allow myself 2 cups a day
Two
of.
cups of coffee, yep.
Um, um, and, and more, I would probably do more, but they just don't, I don't like how it feels and it hurts my stomach and blah, blah, blah. So caffeine is interesting. And I don't mean to be this in a justifying way, but there's what I've read, at least the way caffeine is metabolized in the brain, it does create a wakefulness. It's kind of mild stimulation effect, but it works with different in a different mechanism, so that it doesn't so much hijack this dopamine reward system we're talking about that addiction is based on. Now, if you, and I've done back in an earlier time in my life when I drank much more coffee and gave it up for a while, I had a headache. I mean, so it's clearly it's addictive, right? Because there's this withdrawal kind of stuff, but it's not, it doesn't have that same pull that other kinds of addictive substances has, at least according to neurochemical people. So I'm still leery of it because it's such an addictive thing, and that's why I limit it myself. But I don't stay away from it like I do other things. I just make like a rule of thumb. I don't, as a rule of thumb, don't do other addictive behaviors, drugs, whatever. But I do a lot of caffeine, and I hope that's
Yeah,
helping.
but we're talking coffee, and then there's the
Yeah.
super duper,
Oh,
like I'm thinking Red Bull. I don't even know all the brands of stuff, but like, or they're combining the caffeine with alcohol and like, so
right.
so there's a difference between, this is like when we're talking about baby pop from a long time ago and cannabis now. So there's caffeine like coffee, and then there's caffeine like, on steroids.
Yeah. And that's a really good point. And it goes back to one of the kind of dark corners of this whole addictive process when I'm thinking of tobacco companies that would target kids basically with cute, cartoony labels and brands. And we're seeing that a lot now with these caffeinated drinks that
Hmm.
are clearly targeting kids, adolescents mostly, and they're pretty dangerous in terms of the levels of caffeine that are in them. There's been medical complications, and now you're getting things that are also cutesy looking that have alcohol with the caffeine in it. So yeah, it's a problem. That's a problem. I'm talking about a cup of coffee.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, and I think
Yeah.
you have to be, again, living an examine life. I drink coffee, and I notice if I go out for a run without coffee, my time drops. So I know that there is, and it's not
Interesting.
just, yeah, it's like, I'm not kidding, 20 seconds, a minute, like there is a swing, and I just go, well, some days I go with coffee, some days I go without coffee, and it's
Yeah.
all fine. But it is interesting to me also that, oh, there's a physical reaction to this, this substance. So, okay.
Fascinating.
I have found caffeine does trigger a shopping spree for me. I'm a betrayed partner. That's fascinating.
So, yeah, I'm curious how much caffeine we're talking about there. But one way of looking at this, and this is again into the weeds a little bit, you can really classify addictions as two different kinds of addiction. One kind of being triggering what we call sympathetic arousal, which is the body's fight or flight system, right? We've all, when you're startled or something, what happens, your heart starts to race, your eyes get big, your digestion slows down. And that's all how humans and a lot of mammals actually are wired to escape danger or to fight our way out and so on. So when we look at amphetamines, sex, porn, kleptomania, gaming, uh, a lot of those things create this like fight or flight response. So when we get triggered, like this question just now, when that person kind of gets a reaction, we would go toward one or the other, right? The sympathetic, this fight or flight side or the other. I'll talk about in a second. But yeah, that's very much a definite to. It's a reaction to being triggered, and it's causing a response. It's a way of dealing with that response. I'm not sure it's the best way, but so the other side, by the way, for the sympathetic, this the opposite of that is a parasympathetic, which would be a very kind of relaxing state, going numb, kind of think possum, playing dead, if you will. And so this is where we find alcohol, food, um, binge watching TV, binge shopping, that kind of stuff, kind of mindless stuff that kind of just um, like I was more of an alcoholic, as I've mentioned. I really wanted the numb feeling. I didn't want to stimulate anything, right? I wanted to just kind of numb out. So I think so people are drawn to one or the other. And by the way, the same person can have both. I mentioned earlier, there's kind of the lead up to sex, right? That's often the sympathetic, like stimulating fight or flight thing. After sex, when people have that remorse, the shame, that part of the cycle that we talked about earlier, often it's a different drug they may go to. That's maybe when they go to alcohol or food or something else to numb. So it's you have to really look at the big arc from the very first trigger or craving to the end and see all the different behaviors and drugs that are at play at different stages. They may be not the same either. They may change over time. Interesting.
Yeah, well, and I think about like people who smoke cigarettes and drink a cup of coffee, and so those two things get, paired together, or they always have a cigarette after they have a meal, and so it's hard, and you have to work on changing, if I do this, I have to change the pattern for that, if I'm going to have a cup of coffee, I need to get up and move around or do something so that I'm not having a cigarette. If I'm having a meal, maybe, change where I'm having it so that I don't have a cigarette. So with this, I'm thinking like, yeah, it would be like, if first of all, is having a cup of coffee or if it is having caffeine worth it, if you've got a negative
Right.
thing, it may be, maybe both of those are just going like, yeah, it's just not worth it to do that. Or how do you navigate, I'm going to have one cup of coffee and I'm not going to shop, I don't know. As a betrayed partner, the message would be different than if it was somebody struggling with compulsive behaviors, right off the bat, because then we're looking at the entire pattern of like all of these things are, are, are looking for external, being okay. So,
I'd put a little spacer in there between
okay.
the event and the reaction, right? And so, and that little spacer to me would consist of just being curious and mindful, just really trying to feel what's going on and give that a voice. Maybe you're angry, maybe you're hurt, maybe
Mm.
you're scared, but I think at least just to recognize it, and I think just that by itself, and then give yourself permission to use caffeine or go shopping or whatever anyway. You might find that what happens after that little session of kind of being curious might be different. That might give it enough oxygen, if you will, to like bring down the urge to numb out in some other way. But I definitely it's an opportunity to like examine this and try to apply. Tammy and I were talking earlier about kind of healthy responses versus unhealthy ones, and try to see maybe there's something to journal about, or just to be curious about, or make a call about, or just to notice. Tammy used that a couple of times, and I think it's a really beautiful way of living, is to be just this mindfulness, right? Just to notice. We cannot go through our lives disconnected or kind of not observing, because we'll end up hurt or hurting
Well,
someone
we
else.
can because we did that before. So,
We can, yeah, it can be done,
yes,
right?
it wasn't
Not
good.
not for
So,
optimal results. Let me put it that way.
exactly. Yeah. And I was thinking, you mentioned journaling. I was thinking the same thing. It would be interesting to journal, like while you're ingesting caffeine or after you've ingested
Mhm.
caffeine, of like, okay, what would what am I looking for when I go on a shopping spree? What is the need that is being felt? What am I feeling? Like, that's really what it is what am I feeling right now? That's, because then it's like, okay, I'm feeling whatever, and so to be able to address that feeling, is there a different way to address that feeling rather than going on a
Exactly.
a shopping spree, zero judgment on any of this stuff, so please don't hear that, but it's like, is the shopping spree fulfilling it? Like usually with those things, it's like everything else is kind of hollow. It's like, oh, I've acquired more things again, from an addict standpoint, not a betrayed partner, but addict standpoint, I'd be looking for external things to make me okay. I had to really work on that because, like, because that was another one of those. I was still looking for, you know, something. I will own, I do like, fast cars. And, and that's because I really do appreciate, fine machinery. And like, it's not because it's going to make me okay. It's not going to make me cool. It's not going to make me any of those things. I just, I enjoy having a vehicle. I get it from my dad. It's hereditary, but I had to look at all of that kind of stuff. What is my goal with whatever? I mean, it is not exhausting because I do it so, it's so internalized that I'm pretty consistently checking my motives on things. If I have to do a hard stop and check my motives, there's more stuff going on, and that's an opportunity, to go to a 12-step meeting. So, okay. Is it possible with a couple without intimacy to fight often as a replacement for the intimacy, choosing intensity versus intimacy? Great question.
These are kind of amazing questions, actually.
Yes.
Yes, I think, and this is something that's not talked about a lot. It's just I kind of observed this myself that um, oftentimes the bond is one of intensity, right? And that doesn't necessarily make for the healthiest relationship. There's, I guess, a moral judgment for you. But I think that intensity bond can really lead to a lot of someone gets hurt almost always, and sometimes physically hurt. But it can it's a complicated thing. But that's yes, I mean, and sometimes the two unhealthy parts of people can bond as well, right? And I think and that kind of magnifies the problem as well. Um, I think the intensity bond, I would say, just as a therapist, there's a bond. And I think I would look at that and see, kind of deconstruct that bond a little bit and see if you can maybe create some other aspects of that bond that are maybe less volatile than just intensity. Maybe, some other aspects of intimacy there, vulnerability, trust, communication, caring, that kind of thing. So just kind of see if I guess probe around and see if it's more than just intensity. But yeah, that is definitely a very good observation that I think a lot of people don't make, and it's certainly true. Certainly true.
Yeah,
A lot of
high
times, by the way,
anger and or rage is very powerful.
oh God, yeah, and people will sometimes recreate it, or they'll get out of that situation with a great effort, and then 2 years later, then another one, and that same, so there's something about the appeal of that intensity that needs to be looked at.
Yeah. But you were starting to say something else. I'm sorry, cut you off.
Um, it's gone. I don't
Okay,
know.
sorry.
So no,
Yeah,
no problem.
but that was yeah, that's a great question. And in those situations, I often say it's like doing the negative two step. You do this, I do this, you do this, I do this. And until one of you is willing to change the choreography, you're going to keep on those patterns, and it is a connection, and a negative connection is better than no connection. We talk often with relationships that, if there is indifference, then the relationship may be waning, and maybe, somebody's looking to leave it. But if you're still in it, even if it's negative and toxic, and, like I feel, I just feel all this anger and rage, you're still in it. And for me, like I had to work, I would get this rage. I hated it. But it was so intense and powerful. And like I had to like close myself off as soon as I felt it coming up, because I knew that whatever I was going to say was going to be not good. But I did some EMDR, and honestly, that I have not felt that since, which I'm incredibly grateful for. But it was so powerful. I can, it is, um, I can see why people would get addicted to that, because it was a very powerful feeling. I didn't like it because I knew I would be on the destructo path, but
Mm, good
okay,
observation.
I think we are out of time. Yes, we are. Thank you, Dr.
Yeah,
David. Thanks for all the great questions. Thanks for joining us, and
yeah,
and
great
those
stuff.
were really helpful, and interesting. So come join him again in 2 months, and Kristen Snowden will be the second week next month, and we've got a whole bunch of special edition webinars. So check those out on our website. and join for those as well. I'm excited about some of those topics too. All right. Thanks,
Great.
everyone. Bye.
Okay. Thanks, Tammy. Bye-bye.